Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. Today we're going to give a look to how free the line from the opponent's sword in 4 different ways. So in these conditions, of course, we have the weapon of the opponent, which is in the center, more or less in front of us, in a longa or languid position, whatever you want to call it, and we have to free the line. So we have a variety of conditions, and the first one is the bind on top of the opponent's sword. So ideally, we want to bind on top of the opponent's sword in such a way that the opponent wants to free the sword and attack on the other line. And in this case, we want to prevent this kind of thing. So our plan is this one. We bind on top of the opponent's sword and we want to make the opponent attack on the other line in such a way that we land a parry post on top of that attack. This is our plan. This is the first way to free the line from the opponent's sword, by simply making the opponent being greedy and feeling the chance to be able to reach us with the next attack. Simply because he wants to steal the time of our bind. Unluckily, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't happen, depending from how much the opponent is prepared to receive our bind. So it's a risky action as any other fencing action. But if we are prepared enough, if we keep the correct distance, or actually we make the distance vary during this action, so we enter and we instantly flee while parrying the opponent's attack, then we can land these technique, these tactics actually, in a safe way. Now, of course, if the opponent doesn't flee the bind, we can strike a direct action toward the opponent. This is the ideal condition, but of course it rarely happens because the opponent tends to flee. There is also the neutral condition in which the opponent frees the weapon and remains at distance, so he doesn't attack, and in that case it is best to avoid doing anything if we don't have another plan prepared for this kind of condition. The second plan, or 1.5 if you prefer, is an outcome basically of the previous condition. So we may feint in the bind. So by feinting in the bind, we provoke the opponent parry. And if we provoke the opponent parry, we may steal the time from the opponent. So the idea is simple. We bind, we feint in the bind, which means that we control the bind in a decent way, at least, so that we do not risk being counter-attacked in the bind. And on the opponent parry, we land an attack. We can, of course, choose the target depending from which kind of action we are landing at first. So if our, for instance, thrust in the bind is low or high or whatever, depending from the reaction of the opponent, ideally we land the best attack. Of course, it is not always possible, but it is desirable anyway. Now, the third option is hand sniping. Now, hand sniping an opponent in longa is, for some motivation, considered something risky by certain people. Actually, if the opponent has the weapon already extended, it is one of the best conditions in which we may land a hand snipe, if of course we find a free line to use, simply because the opponent may only move thanks to their footwork and doesn't have the extension of the arm which is threatening us. Remember that the arm extension doesn't only help moving forward, which is something extremely important actually, but also makes our perception of distance vary a little bit. So it is not that easy to understand the distance from the opponent if compared to having an opponent which has the weapon extended forward. So in that kind of condition, landing a hand snipe is perfectly good. Actually, it is one of the best options. Now, in these kind of conditions, the only thing that you have to do is to pay attention to where the opponent's crossguard is. So if the crossguard is vertical, it is better to land hand snipes which are horizontal. And on the opposite, of course, if the opponent weapon, the opponent crossguard, is horizontal, then it is best to land a vertical hand snipe, such as the Sottano one, for instance. Now, how this action opens up the line? Now, it depends from what happens. Now, if you hit the opponent, no problem. So you ended up hitting the opponent, and ideally you should defend yourself after it. So ideally, step backward and parry, get into the bind in some kind of way. It is the ideal thing to do, in my opinion. But if the opponent basically manages to void the action, so to void your hand snipe, then it is the condition in which you ended up opening up the line. This condition can be used to land an attack. It can be used to actually land a parry riposte, because maybe the opponent, after voiding the action, starts with an attack. So you have a variety of possibilities, and in this case, unluckily, you have to plan on top of the opponent's habits. You are forced actually to plan over the opponent's habits, which is also true for other actions, but in this case even more. And you have to scout for the opponent's reactions to your hand snipe. So ideally, if the opponent just voids the action, remaining on the spot and doesn't step backward, you can plan for another attack. So you hand snipe and then you land an attack on the deep target. Instead, if the opponent flees backward and steps backward, you can follow the opponent and attack, but it is of course a little bit more risky, but it may work, of course. Or if the opponent voids the action, either by standing still or just retreating a little bit and then attacks, then you can parry riposte on top of that action and land your own attack against them. Now the last option is beating aside the opponent's sword. Now here we have two outcomes from this kind of thing. Now either we beat aside the opponent's sword and the opponent we beat aside or downward, depending from which kind of technique we land. If we beat the weapon away and the opponent uses the momentum, the opponent may land an attack on the other line. So in such kind of case, it is ideal to beat and instantly parry the opponent's attack. Again, we need to scout for the opponent's reaction in this kind of case, if we want to reliably land something that works. If instead the opponent doesn't use the momentum of the beat, we can land our attack. So ideally here we have two outcomes from the same condition. We either beat aside and attack, which is ideal, it is the canon, let's say, or we beat aside, and because the opponent does something which is using the momentum, then we should land a parry riposte. So pay attention to this kind of difference. This happens especially with the longsword, because we have two hands on the handle and we have far more control on our sword. This means that using the momentum of the opponent's beat is far easier. And so this kind of action of landing the beat, the opponent uses the momentum, and we have to parry riposte, happens far more compared to other weapons. So pay attention to it. Very good, people. I hope you will find this video useful in some ways. 4 ways to open up the line when the opponent is in Langot or Longa. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to check my Patreon, link in the description if you want to support me and especially the channel. Thanks for watching again, and see you next time.